keep it simple. The simpler, the more the team can work together and we can make the right decisions in the game for success. But he had said, the game of football is very simple, but being simple is the hardest thing to teach.
Deciding what to do is your responsibility. You have to believe that below all of that is this profound, inherent, but invisible simplicity. And the second thing is you must be willing to put in the effort. If you have this mindset of everything is just an experiment, and the outcome of the experiment is I want to find out what works and what doesn't, what's the simplest way to help somebody rather than harm them, that to me is what drives me and what gets me up in the morning.
Welcome to Born Superhuman. Every day we make decisions in life, and those decisions directly affect the path that we take forward. Well, I made a decision from last Sunday when I met the most incredible gentleman at a party that had this dynamic scientific narrative as to decision making and what we actually do with our life and how we can change it or evaluate it. Now, I was so impressed that I wanted to get him on this podcast as soon as possible. And less than a week later, I'm sitting here with the brilliant Dr. Alan Barnard. So with that being said, Dr. Alan, welcome to Born Superhuman.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's an absolute honor to be on this podcast.
It's great to have you here. And you're going to blow people's minds the way that even in only a 20-minute conversation, you sent me back with so many questions and thoughts in my head in such a positive way. So I'm so excited to share this, and I hope that everyone makes the decision to listen to this because it will affect your life, not just with an opinion. This is scientific, fact-proof research that you've gone so deep into. That's what makes me so excited. But before we get to that, tell us about you as a kid growing up. How did you get into the line that you are, and what inspired you?
I grew up in South Africa. We grew up with very, very little resources, and that had a positive impact in two ways in my life. It turned me into an entrepreneur very early on because I realized that if I wanted a bicycle, I would have to make money to buy a bicycle. There just wasn't enough resources to be able to afford luxuries like that. So that was a huge privilege. I became an entrepreneur when I was 8 years old, delivering newspapers, working in gardens, etc. But the other reason why it was so privileged is I spent a lot of time on my grandfather's farm. My father was in the Air Force. He was traveling a lot. And my grandfather was an amazing storyteller, a farmer, but also a deep philosopher. And he thought deeply about things and challenged me to think deeply about everything, to ask the question, why? He gave me on my 10th birthday this book called The Marquis Who's Who. It's like an encyclopedia, but it contained biographies of the most successful people in every field. And he said to me I should read this book because he realized that I was very interested in what makes people successful. And he said, read the book. And he quizzed me about it and said, what did you notice? And I said, the first thing that struck me was almost none of the people in this book had perfect starting conditions, even good starting conditions. Many of them, like me, grew up in an environment without much resources. Often they suffered some kind of neglect or even abuse. And many of them suffered what we consider, at least at that stage, as learning disabilities, things like dyslexia and others. And yet, despite all of that, they become giants within the field. And the question is, how can it be? And so that intrigued my curiosity. And he said, so what did you come up with? And I remember sort of vividly thinking about, well, there seems to be, from what I've seen, in terms of the pattern, there seems to be 4 factors that significantly increase our success. 2 of them, at least at that stage, was out of our control, which is good genes and good luck, right? If you have good genes, if you're good looking like highly intelligent, life is going to be a little bit easier. We can't deny that, right? And if you're not that good looking, you're not that bright, which is how I felt most of the time as a kid growing up, life is going to be a bit harder. I remember sitting at the back of the class and thinking I am the only kid that's not understanding what the teacher is trying to teach. It made me feel horrible. Later on, I discovered that the disability that I had in learning, which is getting overwhelmed by complex things, like all weaknesses, also had a major strength, is that it would take me a long time to figure something out, but once I got it, I really would get it. So there were these two factors that I realized was out of our control: genes, and good genes, good luck, and they don't make it impossible. If you don't have those, you'll have to work harder. But there were two things that were in our control that I realized. The first one that all of these successful people had in common is they were absolutely driven and were willing to work hard. In many cases, much harder than anybody else in their field. And I realized that that trumped the natural talents. If you were just willing to work harder than anybody else, you will have a much higher probability of succeeding. And I immediately applied that to my school. It sucked because I wasn't that interested, but I realized if I worked harder than anybody else, I could get to the top of the class. But the second thing that I realized that was so important is that somehow these successful people had the ability to, first of all, avoid making really bad decisions, things that could really wipe out your reputation, bankrupt you, cause you to die, and they also had the ability to make really good decisions. And that's how I got fascinated to the area of decision making. And I ended up making that my passion. Like most entrepreneurs, I turned my passion into a business. And I studied engineering, later psychology, economics, and then did a PhD in innovation and technology. But it was all about this life goal of helping people make better, faster decisions when it really, really matters. How to avoid making really bad decisions, how to make really good decisions when it matters.
Fascinating, because how old were you again when your grandfather gave you the encyclopedia?
I was 10 years old, and what's beautiful about the story, and I might tear up because this is emotional, is 40 years later, I got a copy of that same book, The Marquis Who's Who, in my mail, and it had my name in it for my contribution to decision science and theory of constraints. So kind of went full circle.
What a beautiful full circle. And I understand, because it still is in honor of your grandfather as well, who had the care in actually seeing you and then sharing that book with you. How long did it take you to read it? Because an encyclopedia for an adult can be daunting, let alone a 10-year-old. So your fascination had to be there. How long did it take you to read?
I mean, it probably took a month or two, but, first of all, we didn't have television in those days. It was the 1970s, and my mother used to tell the story, and it's kind of weird when I heard it because, I felt like I said this, I was in school and I really didn't feel like I was getting it. I always felt like the little stupid kid sitting at the back of the class. But for some reason, I was very fascinated with mathematics, later became fascinated with computer science. And my mum used to tell the story where one day I walked into the kitchen. I must maybe have been 7 or 8 years old, in a panic. And apparently, I had been playing around with fractions. Why? Don't know, 7, 8-year-old, and started learning fractions. It was fascinating. And I said to her, Mum, if you sleep 8 hours a day, does that mean you sleep a third of your whole life? And she's like, yes, kind of. And I went, that's, the story about the afterlife, because we were brought up as Christians, I mean, that's nice story and idea. I don't know if it's true. All I know is, if you die, it's kind of game over. And there's a lot of things that I want to learn and do in life. So I started practicing to not need so much sleep. Staying up later, waking up earlier. And in the end, I got it down to about 4 or 5 hours. So I had a lot more time. That was part of this idea of, or realization, if I'm just willing to put in more time and effort than most other people, I could probably succeed at what I was passionate about.
So that means you were basically sleeping about 1/5 of your life, or even less than that, which, with Born Superhuman, I'm a huge believer that our body adapts to what we do. But you were such a young age figuring that out. And I believe that's where genius comes from.
Yeah.
It's
And, and
silence.
and one thing I've learned since then is, you have to listen to your body, right? So still on average, if you go onto my iPhone now, you'll sleep that my average is around 4.5 hours, right? That's my average sleep. But there are some nights when I sleep 6, 7 hours because my body needs it. So I've just learned, I always sleep with my windows open, so I can see the natural light come in, and I let the natural light wake me up, you know.
Yeah.
So it's just something that, sometimes you need more sleep. I'm just lucky that probably because of practice and maybe a little bit of help from my genes that I don't need to sleep 8, 9 hours. In fact, if I sleep that long, I wake up feeling, not good. It doesn't feel good.
Yeah, it's one thing we've had on here with some of the sleep experts. Some will say you have to sleep this much of time, but the ones that really stood out to me is we're all individual, we're all unique. Some people will be night owls and they're not going to
Yeah.
fit into the circadian rhythm of sunrise and sunset. And I love that you say that because we are all unique and we need to feel exactly who we are and what we are and make those decisions for ourselves, not because someone said, but because we know ourselves best. And
Yeah.
again, you're the best test. So let's moving on from that. You then go into mathematics. You're then studying the whole engineering side. How did you then get it back to your passion of decision making? And was there a story in that encyclopedia that stood out of all the people you read about that still to this day inspires you? Apart from your own, of course.
Sure. I think probably one of the first stories was, when you get into the cycle of feeling you're not good enough, that you don't belong, you sit at the back of the class or you sit at the table, at work, and you see everybody else that seem to be getting it and you don't. It can quickly turn into a vicious cycle. Because what I've learned much later on is that our brains are really validation engines. We don't rationalize and then we decide. We decide and then we rationalize. So when we believe something is true, the mind will find evidence to support it. So when we believe we can do something, right, the
Mm.
mind will find evidence. And if we believe we can't or that we're not good enough, it will find evidence. So I read this quote. One of the giants in that book was Henry Ford. And one of his most famous quotes of all time is, whether you believe you can or can't, you are right. And I always try to bring it down to a very practical level. I mean, it would be really cool to find out that somehow the universe cares what we believe. You know, that would be really super interesting. My view has always been very skeptical about that, and to say, but it does seem to matter in what way. If you believe you can do something, at least you will try. And that's sometimes all that's needed is just try something that you're super scared about. And then you find out it's not that bad. Like, what's the worst that can happen if I go and ask this girl for a dance, which was always one of my biggest fears? I was super nerdy, never had a girlfriend. And then you go, the worst that can happen is she can say no.
And
And
you're in
now
the
you
same position.
know.
Yeah, you're exactly the
Exactly.
same position. Yeah.
So that quote to me really had a profound impact on me, and I took that very literally. I said, if I if I want to do something, achieve something, make a contribution, I wanted at that stage I had a very specific goal that I just wanted to come up with one original idea that somehow would make my life worth meaning, have meaning and fulfillment, is being able to contribute one idea that would get you published somewhere, right? That would give you legacy, the eternal life, as if you could come up with one idea. So, as you rightly pointed out, I went and studied engineering. because there's some foundational skills that you need, like computer science. I was very lucky to get into computer science quite early on and been coding since I was probably 11, 12. But there was something that immediately struck me, and I picked it up from both engineering and science. In science, there's this fundamental concept that says you can't prove anything right. You can only prove it wrong. So the whole essence of the scientific method is often quite misunderstood. When you're doing real science, you're designing an experiment to try and falsify your theory or hypothesis. You're not trying to prove it right. You're trying to prove it wrong. It makes you think about, like, how could I prove this thing that I believe is true to be wrong? And it's kind of beautiful because today people know it as kind of the black swan experiment, something that was popularized by somebody that became a mentor of mine, Nassim Taleb. He wrote this book called Black Swan. But imagine you're a scientist and you've gone all around the world and you had this belief that all swans are white. And you set up experiment after experiment, and every experiment gave you this resounding results. Yep, another checkbox. All the swans that we observed here were white, right? And at some point you say, now I can confidently say that all swans are white. The counter to that is called one case is a proof. You just need one swan that's black that destroys your whole theory. So it's much better to set out to say, how can I falsify the claim that all swans are white? Let me go and look for other colors. Right? That will immediately challenge my belief. And every time we challenge a belief, that's how we advance our thinking. The challenge that we have from a psychological perspective, like I mentioned, is our brains are validation engines. And not even intelligence makes us immune to it. There's really good studies that shows highly intelligent people with PhDs, when presented with data that counters their theories, they either immediately ignore the data, they literally become blind to the data, or if they can find a way of not becoming blind to the data, they immediately find excuses to exclude the data. So that to me was this thing about, on the one side, this basic idea of, whether you believe you can or can't, you are right. At the same time, there's this other thing that says you can never prove yourself right. You can always prove yourself wrong. What do you do with this? And it got me thinking. I thought, what if we changed the way that we look at the beliefs that we have? Rather than trying to think of them as right or wrong, which is kind of what I was confronted with religion and all of these things, right? It's right or wrong. What if we rather think about them as helpful or harmful? Would that be useful? So I have a belief that I can do something. Is that belief helpful? Yes, if it gets me to try. Can it be harmful? Yes, if I believe I can walk on a tightrope between two buildings and I haven't put in the 10,000 hours to master the skill, I'm going to fall off and die. That's not helpful, that's harmful. So that's kind of one of my first things that started shaping the way I looked at everything, including religion, by the way. And I still have that belief today, is if somebody says to me, are you religious? And what do you think about the fact that I am religious? My first question is not whether it's true or not, is it helpful to you? Right? If you have an absolute fear of dying, or you are deeply, deeply disturbed by the fact that life doesn't seem fair, then religion can be extremely helpful to you. But if you're deeply concerned about why somebody had to die for your sins and that we're all born in sin, it can be quite harmful. So that really shaped the way that I do science today is I don't look for what is right or wrong. I look for what is helpful versus harmful.
Yeah, it's a fascinating way of thinking. This way, anyone listening, you'll understand now why I was so gripped in our conversation and disappointed when it stopped after 25 minutes at the party. But I've never thought of it. Again, whenever we challenge the mind to then tap into the brain and the brain pushes back with that's different than what I've learned, it's fascinating the conversation, which I believe is how philosophers get together and discuss and come up with things that are helpful, not
Yes.
things that are harmful. So how did you then take that and the knowledge that you're gaining, and I would say probably the massive curiosity that feeds your life to prove you're wrong, I guess
Yes.
is where we go. How did that turn around now into specific decision making and the science behind it?
So from each field that I studied, I took something away. I wanted to find out, if you go back to my original aha moment, is that very successful people seem to have developed three skills. One is they are really good at identifying and avoiding really bad options. The second thing is they are very good at identifying or creating good options. And last thing is they are relentless at learning from experience. So I'll take each of these and just give you some basic insights that I got for each of them. So the first one is, what is a really bad decision? If you study mathematics, options trading, it's a form of applied mathematics, right? A really bad option would be one that has a small upside if it works and a big downside if it doesn't, right? Like a
Mm.
really practical example, at one stage we got involved in studying, relationships. And it's like seeing people that really threw everything away, threw a one-night stand, right? And you think about that as an option. Really small upside if it really worked. Huge downside if it didn't, right? Which often happens. So it's a kind of what I call a hell no decision. So think about that as like, if you were teaching somebody about decision making, by far the most important skill is to get them to think not about the likely outcome, but best case, worst case, right? And what you want to do is to use that as a way of deciding, is this a good option? If the best case is a huge upside and the worst case is a small downside, that's a good option, good decision. But if it's the opposite, if best case is only a small upside, worst case is a big downside, really bad option. Avoid those like the plague. So that kind of helped me to identify both the good and bad decision options. As avoid the really bad ones, go for the really good ones, or can you create options with big upside, big downside? But the third element I found fascinating was these successful people somehow had control over their emotions. And that to me was a fascinating thing from two perspectives. One, I think I discussed with you a little bit. I became curious about, why did we evolve emotions? Because as soon as you start looking at decision making and you talk to people like, why did you make this bad decision? Oh my God, it was my emotions. I overreacted or underreacted out of fear or frustration, or exaggerated fears, exaggerated frustrations or expectations. So when it comes to decision making, it looks like emotions is actually quite harmful, not very helpful. But if you trust in evolution, we wouldn't have developed something if it was harmful. It would have been discarded a long time ago. That doesn't mean it can't be harmful, but on the net, it means that it must have a much bigger upside than downside. And what I realize when you think about most decisions that we make in this very complex world that we live in today, we will never have all the information that we need to make the decision, number one. And secondly, we'll never be able to predict accurately what will happen, both the positives and the negatives, right? And yet we have to make a decision. How do we do it, right? We have to decide, what to go and study, what friends to have, what friends not to have, whether to get married, whether to have kids, what work we're going to do, when are we going to quit our job and have our own job, when are we going to get a divorce. These are enormously consequential decisions and hugely complicated. If you try to mathematically model them, you think, oh my God, there's no mathematical model I can build that can help me to make these decisions. So how the hell do we make them? Because we have to make them, right?
Right.
And it turns out that emotions is an incredibly powerful hack to make these incredibly complex decisions. Why? What if the only main criteria is how the decision will make you feel? You have two options. Which one will make you feel the best? Right? So you're selecting a partner, right? We did some research about people that met during a 2-minute speed date, right? And they made a decision right that evening. And they lived happily ever after. And you go like, how on earth is that possible? 2 minutes of information compared to many of us that went on multiple dates, maybe even lived together for a few years, and then it still turned out to be a wrong decision. And what we found out from these people when we asked them is when you really time constrain your brain, there's only two things that your mind is paying attention to. Can this person make me feel special and safe? And can I do the same for them? And that is the only information which we need. Even though we know very little about them and we can't predict what will happen, if in that moment our intuition tells us, and over the many, many hundreds of thousands of years, we've developed incredible intuition. Sometimes it's massively wrong, but in things that we've developed that is really good is how they make us feel. So that to me was a very, very profound insight from a decision-making side. I realized that our emotions has a big impact on our decisions. Sometimes it can cause us to overreact because of an exaggerated frustration or an exaggerated expectation and cause us to make really bad changes in our life. Sometimes emotions can cause us to underreact, procrastinate because of an exaggerated fear of loss or effort or risk. But we shouldn't get rid of emotions. Why? Because they are so powerful. If we can just focus on what do we really want and what do we really want to avoid? What are those emotions we really want? We want meaning. We want fulfillment. We want joy. We want love, We want to avoid sadness, depression, hatred, anger, That becomes really powerful criteria to make incredibly complex decisions.
It's fascinating listening to it because, again, when you, like you said, you don't want to take the emotion out, but you don't want to have the wrong emotion, which then goes back to your first point, which was risk versus reward ultimately. Yeah. You don't want to have too much of a risk with a little reward, but is the emotion driving that? Which takes me back to when we were younger and people say, well, go sleep on it.
Yes.
Because when you go sleep on it, which is it's the same kind of message because we weren't in control of our emotions and we didn't want to make the wrong decision. And normally when we stop the excitement emotion or the anger emotion too much to then make a decision and commit, it's fascinating. What was the second one though? Because you said there were three things you discovered.
So it's avoiding the really bad decisions, being able to identify or create really good options, big upside, small downside. The other one is learning from experience, right? And what I learned was that we don't learn from experience. It turns out we learn from experiments.
Explain.
We have incredibly good feedback mechanisms, but they only work when we are doing an experiment, not when we're just experiencing life. So a very simple example, touch a hot stove plate, right? It burns you immediately. That's how our feedback mechanisms is supposed to work. You try something, you get feedback, and you learn from the feedback. I make a prediction about how I think you will react when I say something to you. I see you react in a different way, and I learn, right?
Mm.
I learn that I need to say it in a different way or say something differently in order to get you to react in a way that is helpful rather than harmful to you and to me. But now think about that touching the hot stove plate. What would happen if it burned you a day later? How long will it take you to put these two things together? Or maybe a week later?
Or how many times would you burn yourself before the feedback came through, at which point you've deteriorated?
Absolutely. So what I realize is that really successful people understand this and they are willing to do a lot of experiments and they learn fast. So you do experiments not to fail fast. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine when they go, you need to fail fast. No, you need to learn fast, right? That's the reason why we do experiments. So that to me was a fundamental thing in this to say, think about every decision that you are making as an experiment to learn from about what worked, what didn't. Was this helpful or harmful? And that to me shifted my mind completely. Suddenly, life is fascinating.
I love that because it took me back to when I used to be in physics and chemistry, and you'd be trying these things, and the teacher knew what the result was going to be, but you'd do something different and give the teacher a different result. Well, you did it wrong, but we discovered something new
Yeah,
by getting it wrong. Have you found, though, but by experimenting, it changes the concept of fear?
absolutely. And I got that insight from a client of mine. Many years ago, I was called in one of the areas that I specialize in is called theory of constraints, is to understand that complex systems, you can, try to analyze and improve and manage them by breaking them up into their parts and analyze and improve and manage every part. But that doesn't work. It often makes the system worse, right? Not just waste a lot of attention and scarce resources. Theory of constraints says it turns out that there's an amazing hack. You can analyze and manage and improve the whole system just by analyzing, managing, improving the constraint of the system. It's like a chain. Focus on the weakest link, make that stronger, the whole chain becomes stronger. Focus on any other links, doesn't matter how weak they are, and the system doesn't get stronger. So we've applied this methodology to projects. And I was approached with one of the largest SAP software implementations in the world, which was a $5 billion project over 5 years. And after just 6 months, the project was already 6 months behind. And I was asked to go and do an audit on this and give them my diagnosis and suggestions for treatment and dosage, right? Similar to if you were a medical practitioner, right? Diagnosis, treatment, dosage. And my conclusion was quite shocking to them that they had done an implementation of a methodology, it was failing, and if they wanted to get the result, that they would have to need to re-implement it from scratch, else the project was going to be late. It was a major thing right in the middle of this, right? It's like you can imagine people have to go for retraining. There's a whole bunch of changes that would happen. And somehow I got the chief project officer to agree to this recommendation. Fast forward, the project is delivered a month before, completely anticlimactically, and this person takes me out for a steak dinner in Singapore to say thank you. And we get to the end, and I say to him, Yak, I have a question for you that's intrigued me for a long time. This was a massive change for you to make. I was recommending this massive. It was a small thing, but it had massive impacts, right? And I deeply admired the courage that you had to agree to it. Is there anything that I said that gave you that courage or that helped a lot? And he said, Alan, there was one thing that you said. And I'm like, notebook out, like, okay, what was this profound thing? And he said, all that you said is, we're not going to make a change. This is not an improvement project. We're going to try an experiment. if we change this one thing, we'll start seeing that the teams will start increasing their rate of completion. The number of tasks per week that they're finishing will grow up dramatically if my hypothesis is correct. I just want us to do an experiment for a month. He said, that's exactly the same message I gave to my team. And from that moment, change programs, improvement programs, the word is banned. What we replaced it with is we're going to do an experiment, one experiment to learn from fast. So be very clear about the assumptions that you want to test and be very clear about having mechanisms that give you fast feedback. So focus on what you want to test and get the fast feedback. So that made a profound change in my life in terms of how I also think and now teach about decision making. Every decision is just an experiment to learn from.
There's so much wrapped up in this. It's almost like a river with so many estuaries that are going off all to the same ocean, but which one are you going to take? Because I got so many questions. I know in business, and I went to Wharton Business School, I studied there, and they said the three most important components of a business starting up is your team is number one, your team is number two, and number three is your team.
Yeah.
And if you don't put them together right, it may seem great today, but down the road, it's going to fail. And it's so critical. It's the same in relationships, like you've already said. Speed dating compared to long time dating. Why are we actually getting involved? What is the reason behind it? And does it have a good upside? And what's the feelings that we have of safety? And also, how does that person make me feel?
Yeah.
People that are listening to this, what do you find is a common or the most common decision-making protocol that people could apply to their life that would give them more success and happiness?
I got inspired very early on in my life. I met somebody that became a mentor of mine, Dr. Eli Goldratt. He was the one that created theory of constraints. He wrote this book called The Goal that became one of the 150 most read books of all time. It's a book that has been read by Elon Musk, and he is very vocal about practicing this methodology of don't look at everything, find a bottleneck, focus just on solving the bottleneck until it moves, and then look for the next bottleneck. Jeff Bezos, the same thing. Jensen Huang from NVIDIA, same thing, right? So this method that he's developed had a profound impact, and it was incredible for me to be able to be close to this person. I ended up being very close to him for over 20 years. But he said something to me the first time we met, and he said something to me literally just a few days before he passed away. And it's words that have inspired and haunted me every day of my life. He said to me, Alan, do not dare stand in my shadow. Stand on my shoulders.
Absolutely
You
beautiful.
know where the standing on shoulders come from. It comes from Newton, right? I could see so far because I was standing on the shoulders of giants. So that's something profound that he taught me, is that when you are embarking on a new field that you want to make a contribution in, right? You want to discover one of five things. I call them the 5 C's. You're passionate about some field. You want to discover a new consequential problem that nobody spotted, or that they didn't realize how substantial the impact of it was, right? Like today with health, we know about mitochondria. This was something that was completely ignored. This is now the number one problem that we're trying to solve, dysfunctional mitochondria, right? The second contribution you can make is classification, coming up with new names for things, classifying them, or correlation, how these parts relate to each other. Number 4, the cause and effect between them. And number 5, a commercial application that can allow you to create value with one of these insights. So he challenged me, stand on the shoulders of giants. And one of the giants I stood on was Jack Canfield. Jack, famous author, most successful non-fiction writer of all time, 600 million books sold. His first book, Success Principles, he introduced this formula called E plus R equal O. Events plus response equal outcome. And the way that he introduced it was that the first principle of success is you have to accept 100% responsibility for your actions. And it's your actions that result in the outcomes that you get. It's your response. It's not the events. The events are mostly out of your control. Can we influence them? Of course we can, but they're mostly out of our control. That's where good luck and bad luck comes in, right? But it's your response that matter. You have a positive event and a positive response, you get a double positive outcome. You have a negative event and a negative response, you have a double negative outcome. You've made it worse. You have a positive event and a negative outcome, like you tell your wife, oh my gosh, you look so beautiful, here's some flowers, and she goes, what do you want? It's like kills it, right? Or what did you do wrong? But you can also have a negative event. Somebody criticizes you and you have a positive response. Rather than defend or attack back, you say, wow, this sounds serious. What's going on in your life? Tell me about it. Right? So that formula to me was something that I wanted to stand on the shoulders to. So as a decision scientist, what I realized, and I hope all the readers, all the listeners and viewers will take this, is that it can also highlight what are the mistakes that we can make when we make decisions. So the first mistake that we can make is an event happened and it's not significant, or there's something that it's something that we can't do anything about. Should we waste any time or energy on thinking about a response? No. Else we're dealing with noise. And I think just from that perspective, when people think about all the things that are stressing them out, these are events that have happened that they became aware of. First question, is it an important event? Will it impact me if I do something or don't do something? And most of the time it's no. Second question is it something I can actually do something about? No. Ignore it. That's by far the biggest mistake that people make, is they respond to things that they shouldn't, and it consumes all their attention, which means that there's no attention or money left to respond to things that actually matters. So that's the first mistake, is really look at the events part. The second mistake that we make, that you were referring to about, go and sleep on it, is that we think that the R doesn't stand for response. We think it stands for react. We react to events. And when we react, we overreact and we underreact. So slowing down your thinking, just taking that, sometimes it's not necessary to sleep on it. Just take a deep breath. Ask yourself, is this an event that requires a response from me, or that will benefit from a response from me? If not, then let it go. If so, then go into your mind of thinking that says, okay, I now need to think about this and make sure I have the best possible response. When we are in react mode, you're probably aware of it, but we have 5 natural reactions that we've inherited through instinct. And the best way that the viewers and listeners can remember this is, imagine you're a caveman and you're being attacked by a vicious animal. I grew up in South Africa, so that'd probably be a lion, right? Terrified of a lion. Our instinct will cause us to do one of 5 things. The first one is flee, right? If you can flee, get the hell away from it. What happens if that's not an option? When you realize that if you're going to run, it's going to catch you because it's a little bit faster than you. The second instinctive reaction is to freeze, hope that they don't see us. Maybe that works. If that doesn't work and they do see us, the third reaction, third F, is fawning, basically subordinating, right? You see it with small little animals, right? The small dog roll over and say, look, I'm here, I'm no threat to you. You can bite me, I can't do anything back. And mostly, if the lion isn't really, really hungry, it will sniff around and push you around a little bit and go, okay, it's no threat, and be curious and go off, right? So fawning can help them do that. That's the best possible thing. But what if that doesn't help? Then it's fighting. Now you have to fight for survival. But there's a fifth mode, instinctive mode, that most people forget about. And that's to go into flow. And that happens when you take that deep breath, when you become hypersensitive of what's actually happening around you. And when you're in flow, as you know, you become hyper creative and hyper productive. So that to me is the other part of the lesson from that E plus R equal O, is don't be tempted to react in one of the four Fs, right? And we do that in workplaces now. It's not just angry, vicious animals that attacked us. Somebody says something to us. They're not a physical threat, but they're an emotional threat, right? Rather than protecting these four instincts, protecting us from physically dying, they now mostly used to prevent us from emotionally dying, right? And that causes us to over or underreact. So a good thing is, if it's an important event, you feel you have to respond to it, do whatever it takes. For some people, it's breathing. For some people, it's more advanced forms of meditation. For some people, it's just making the time to sit down and think, put some music on, whatever, get into flow. And then the last thing that we often fail at is when it comes to the outcome, which is we often don't think about what we really want and want to avoid. And that turns out to be massively useful, to think about what's the best possible response. So if I'm thinking, going back full circle to how we started, I want options that have a big upside if it works and a small downside if it doesn't, right? So if I'm thinking about how should I respond to you that's just criticized me, if my mind immediately goes, I want the outcome of this to be a big upside if it works, small downside if it doesn't, how should I respond to the criticism? Secondly, I want to avoid a really bad option, which has only a small upside. If it really works, it might make me feel strong and powerful if I immediately fire back, but it has a big, big downside if it doesn't work, right? So understanding the real outcome that you want, that often helps you to come up while you're in a state of flow, which is Tony Robbins speak about that all the time. He says, there's three S's: strategy, story, and state, right? Strategy is how we're going to do something. Story is why haven't we done it? Why we think it's impossible, why we can't. State is getting us into a mindset where we can change our story and then be open to strategy. And that to me is that state of mind we have to get into, is the flow state of mind.
Yeah, again, it goes back. It takes me back in my life when I was younger, and some of the decisions that I made that were driven by emotion and my sympathetic state driving my reaction of fight, flight. You talk about fawn,
yeah,
and the flee and stuff. And I only have one regret in my life. And I look back and it was driven off of an emotion that I felt if I pushed hard enough back, people would just believe me and I wouldn't have to face a confrontation. And to this day, I can still say it's the one sadness that I have in my life because of the decision that I made under an emotional situation, because I knew I was right as to what was being said, but truth travels on its own two wheels. It only shows up when it's meant to. I can't make someone believe me until there's time for the truth to come out. I made a very poor decision, and to this day, I still live in sadness
So
of what I asked.
I'll give you a kind of a hack that I've developed and somehow people think it's quite useful, right? So imagine a really, I do coaching, and one of the most common questions I get from women clients that are successful in their business or career is, should I have kids? I'm getting to my 40s, my biological clock is ticking. Should
Sure.
I have kids? What should I do? And my advice to them always is, deciding what to do is your responsibility. I can help you to think about how to decide, right? What's the method? So I'll share with you a simple method.
Mm.
So having kids, there's a big portion of genetics and luck involved there, right? And what's very useful is to use this hack of thinking about how a certain outcome will make you feel and then deciding, is it a good option for you? Not generally speaking, but for you personally, based on being very honest with yourself. So I would ask them the question, think, what is the best possible outcome of having kids like for you? This is, oh my God, I have this amazing kids. They're super bright. They're so kind, it's like absolutely adore them. I said, how would that make you feel if it's the best possible outcome? Would it make you feel absolutely euphoric and feeling like you can express your gratitude every single day of your life from that moment on, the first time you hold them in your arms? And what would be your feeling if it's the worst possible outcome? If you say, look, to be honest with you, I'll be a little bit disappointed, but I'll do the best with what I've got, right? You say, if that's going to be your response in terms of your feeling, best case will be absolutely off the chart. Worst case will be a little bit disappointing. Kids are for you. However, if you had an opposite response in terms of feelings, if you say, how would it make you feel if you had the best possible kids out there? And you kind of say, well, it's kind of to my expectation, right? I'm pretty intelligent. We are both pretty good looking. We've got a good family genetics. I mean, I'd be quite happy, but it's kind of to expectation. Well, what if it's the worst possible outcome? I mean, I would be massively disappointed and deeply depressed because it's now changed my whole life. It's like, okay, probably kids are not for you,
Mhm.
right? So you can use this as best case, worst case, not in a very mathematical way of looking at quantifiable risk and rewards, but purely as based on you knowing yourself very well and being brutally honest with yourself. How will it make you feel? And use that as the way of judging, is this a good option for you, yes or no?
What it seems like you've really done, which I love, is you've simplified down the process in what's perceived as a difficult, confusing decision. There was a football manager, Shankly, who used to coach Liverpool Football Club back in England. And when I was a head coach on the Olympic development program, I would say this to the players: keep it simple. The simpler, the more the team can work together and we can make the right decisions in the game for success. But he had said, the game of football is very simple, but being simple is the hardest thing to teach.
Absolutely.
And that's what it sounds like. You've really taken the answer and built backwards with two different answer potentials and said, how do we simplify down the process?
And it's hard to find the simplicity, right? There's another quote that have inspired and haunted me every day, by Jean-Baptiste Perrin, as a French physicist. And he said that the aim of all science should be to substitute visible complexity for invisible simplicity. So if you think about E equal to mc squared, is mathematically, I can tell you, it's one of the simplest mathematical correlations that you can come up with. Three variables, how they correlated, E equal to mc squared. Very simple, right? But they explain an enormous amount of visible complexity. But to be able to find that simplicity, there's two conditions. Number one is you must believe that even though things are very complex, they appear very complex. There's a lot of visible complexity. For example, in decision making, right? As a science, there's an enormous amount of visible complexity. You have to believe that below all of that is this profound, inherent, but invisible simplicity. And the second thing is you must be willing to put in the effort to find the inherent simplicity. It doesn't just show up by itself. Sometimes it takes 20, 30 years to discover it, right? But if you have this mindset of everything is just an experiment, and the outcome of the experiment is I want to find out what works and what doesn't, what's the simplest way to help somebody rather than harm them, that to me is what drives me and what gets me up in the morning.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating because, again, it's the opposite of what we're taught. We're looking for the secret, we're looking for the magic, we're looking for a pill that would take away all the pains that we've had. And yet, the simplicity really is in our lifestyle that
Yeah.
we don't want.
And I think it makes kind of sense, right? Again, if you go back to emotions, imagine, Dan, you approach me and you say, I've got this business, it's hugely complicated. I've been trying to get it profitable for many, many years. I've tried everything. And I say to you, Dan, it turns out that there's this new technology, incredibly sophisticated technology, but it was designed to solve this type of massively complex problem that you have, right? It's very expensive, but it works because it's so sophisticated. From an emotional point of view, you go, right? The reason why I got stuck is because I have this really complex problem. Nothing was sophisticated enough. Now there's this new technology. The resistance to change from your side would be almost zero. You would welcome it, especially if it was easy to use and affordable, right? But now imagine I give you the opposite. I say, I know that your situation is massively complex. It turns out that the solution is profoundly simple. And you have everything that you need to immediately try it. Just eat healthy food and do a bit more exercise, you know, sleep well. That's it. Why is it so hard for people to adopt these simple things? Because emotionally, like, I have no excuses. And we want to be able to have excuses to say, but we're different. Our situation is more complex. I tried everything, it didn't work. So that's the hard part, is it takes not just hard work to find the simplicity, but then to be able to convince people to try it because it looks so deceivingly simple, right? That's another portion of the hard. And that's where many entrepreneurs, they might have done all the hard work to define the simplicity like what you have done, right? In terms of how do you train a team? You've been successful across many different fields of sport because you've discovered something fundamental that's so beautifully simple that it can apply to any complex environment. But often it's hard to get buy-in for that. It's too simple for us. We need a more sophisticated solution. No, actually the opposite. If it's not super simple, it can never work. So
You were,
there's a kind of a two-sided sword, two sides to the sword of that part. Yeah.
you were speaking to me directly there because I have this incredible balance training system that I discovered by accident, went through, saw incredible proof with, I've trained over 70,000 people. And then science backed up what I was doing. I went in the reverse. I didn't go into the science, try and figure it out, and then try and create something.
Yeah.
Okay. And then people look at it and go, but I've tried this, and they're all super sophisticated. Yours is so simple. How could that work? I'm like, because the technology is already in your brain. I'm just creating the opportunity for you now to unleash the miracle within because it's waiting to go there. We don't need magic.
Yeah.
We just need the work, which is the magic.
And that comes back to this willingness to do experiments, right? Even in science, what you've just said is true. Einstein had this idea back in 1916. It took science almost 100 years to figure out how to validate or invalidate what he came up with. We just didn't have the measuring equipment. So much, much later, it was backed up by science, but we could immediately start benefiting from it because the experiment showed that it worked. We didn't understand why, but it just worked, right? So that to me is also this profound insight of going back to just do experiments. And sometimes it's really complex. It might take you years to discover why it's actually working. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it. If you find something that's really simple, that works, that gets results, then use it and get the results. Don't be delayed by, well, it's not scientific yet. Well, because it takes time to figure out how to prove that something actually works and why it works that way. Yes.
Sure. And because there's so much control, I also think as well, especially in America with the resistance, if you don't go through this protocol, this program, this approval, this licensing, then we can't say it works.
Yeah.
And yet the proof is in real life experience that people have gone because they've experimented along the way. And that's shown. Again, you're speaking to me directly because I've had to face the naysayers because it didn't fit in with their scientific ideology, even though it had greater outcomes than the science that they were following.
Yeah, and you fully understand why, right? One of the things that I discovered with my PhD research was that across any field, whether you take personal dieting or you take changes in incentive programs at a company level or the introduction of new products or going into new markets or implementing a new technology, across all these fields, there's like this magical number, about 70% of all of the changes that we make fail. And it not only means not getting the result that we wanted, but actually it makes the system worse. And that's why we have a status quo bias. Thank God for that, because else it would have been worse. So to me, is when I'm presenting a new idea, I'm expecting resistance, right? Not only I'm expecting it, but I want it. I want to find out, why won't you do it? I'm curious to know why people in general, but I want to know specifically if my goal is to help you get a result. And I'm pretty confident, based on my past experiments, that I know what change in behavior is needed for you to get the result. My number one goal is to find out why you wouldn't do it. What's your story? Right? And then to help you build on top of that.
So that just brought up, we had a conversation at the party again that was fascinating. I'd love for you to share it here because we haven't got to that and I totally forgot about it.
Yeah.
But you told me a story about doctors that were frustrated because 70% of their clients wouldn't take the medications. Share that story again because I remember it, but it was fascinating.
So I have to give a bit of context just briefly. So remember that E plus R equal O formula?
Yeah.
Right. So it's a really simple way of understanding quite complex decision making, right? But sometimes it's a bit too simple. And it's too simple in two ways that are very important. One is that there's never just one response to an event. We always have two options. We can do something or don't do something. We can do something or do something different. So that already makes it a bit more complicated, right? The second thing is every response has two outcomes, a positive and a negative outcome. Doesn't matter how good the response is, it will always have a positive and a negative. So I use that insight to stand on Jack Canfield's shoulders to say, how can I take that E plus R equal O framework, stand on his shoulders to also allow us to deal with this real world complexity where you always have two responses and two outcomes per response. So I want to imagine I have a problem, there's some event, right? There's a solution, there's an alternative. The alternative could be the status quo, don't do anything, or do something different. Both of these options have pros, upsides, but they also have cons, downside. What I'm looking for as an innovation, as a breakthrough, is something that gives me the pros of both options without the cons of either, right? I call that was what I did with my PhD is I developed this as a new technique called the pro-con cloud method. Sort of stands on the shoulders of Jack Canfield, of Benjamin Franklin that developed the pro-con list, etc. How I use that is the example that you quoted. I was approached by this blood pressure clinic, and I said to him, what is the one event, the one gap that keeps you up at night? I said 70% of all of our patients don't follow the prescription. I said, okay, and as a result of that, they often don't get better or they get worse. And we feel personally and professionally liable for that. So I said, so what have you tried? He said, we tried to explain to them, right, how good your life will be if you follow the prescription and how bad your life will be if you don't follow it. So we talk about the pros of the solution, always follow your prescription, and the cons of the status quo, not following it, right? And I said, does that work? No, it doesn't. So I said, okay, so it's not ignorance, right? If it was ignorance, then telling them the benefit of doing it or the cons of not doing it, that would be ignorance, then their behavior would change. What is really the cause is some fear. They fear that there's a positive that they associate directly with the status quo, not always taking the prescription medication as prescribed, that they don't want to give up, or there's a con of always taking the prescription medicine that they don't want to live with. So it's one of those things. It's an exaggerated fear of losing this positive of the status quo. So if you think about quitting a bad habit, what's the positive of not quitting? Helps me to cope with stress, right? So if your new innovation doesn't help me or give me an alternative way to cope with stress, I'll just change my addiction. I won't solve it, right? So we asked them to ask their patients, what are they scared of? Well, what will happen if they simply made the switch to always follow the prescription? And we got the doctors to speculate, right, to come up with what they think would be the yes, what I call yes buts, the objections, and the yes and how to mitigate that. And then I asked them to phone one of their worst patients. And I told him what question to ask the patient. And I said to the patient, can you explain to me what will happen if you always follow the prescription? And the patient answered it as if they asked him, what would happen if you don't? Because that's the normal question. Don't you understand? So he started off by saying, I know, doctor, if I don't follow the prescription, my blood pressure won't get better. I might die and leave my family behind. And I made a note to the doctor. I said, can you just pause? And I took over and I said, that wasn't a question the doctor asked you. We're curious. We want to understand, what are you scared of will happen if you always followed the prescription exactly as it's on the bottle? And there was this long silence. And he said to me finally, and I might get emotional, he said, do you know how it makes me feel to have to take blood pressure medication twice a day? Because it makes me feel sick and old. I'm 55 years old. I'm not sick and old. And the doctor immediately responded and said, do you know how many supplements top performing athletes take? He says, I don't know. He says, I can tell you it's hands full, right? They don't take it because they're sick and old. It just helps them to perform at their best. That's the way to think about this medication, right? You're taking it because it helps you to perform at your best. And then the pivot was like this. Immediately changed. So that to me, this idea of sometimes all that we need is to be able to be asked the right question. What are you scared will happen if? Or it's impossible unless, or you can't unless, these are all profound questions that gets people to go inside, find the answer, and change their life themselves.
Yeah, what a great story. It's, again, understanding the person. and what their fears are or how it makes them feel, which so simply goes back to speed dating again.
Yeah.
You look at
And
as you were talking about the way the brain is designed
yes.
under pressure times to
Yeah,
think.
and it's a good example of both cases. It's a good example of how an exaggerated fear, a feeling, can cause me to not make changes that's actually good for me and that I know rationally is will be good for me, but it blocks me because it's trying to protect me from something. It's trying to protect me from giving up something that I have that I want to keep, like keeping a way of coping with stress. And it helps me to avoid something that I don't want, which is how it will make me feel every time I have to do it. Compared to, well, the same emotion can also do the opposite. It can say, it can imagine every time you take it, how it makes you feel is fantastic because I'm doing something, I'm taking an action that allows me to perform at my best, to have the longest health span and lifespan that's possible for me. And that requires recognition and gratitude, and patting yourself on the shoulder because many others don't do that. You do. Feel good about yourself.
Has there ever been scientific research or experiments that have really focused on decision making that then you can transfer back to adults or humans, or was it done with adults?
Yeah, I mean, in every area. So one of the things I do at my research lab is we look at why good people make and often repeat bad decisions, and then trying to use that research to develop decision support methods and apps to help you make better, faster decisions when it really matters. And many of these things is we've known it through correlation, through studying successful people. And it's sometimes many decades later that science catches up, right?
Mm.
So I'll give an example of that. There was a scientific experiment that was done on parole board judges in Israel to try and understand what influences them to grant parole or not to grant parole. And they studied the results, and the results were quite shocking. That in the first thing in the morning, about 60% of people that apply for parole gets granted with parole. Just before lunch, it drops down to almost zero. And the first reaction of the researchers is it because they schedule all the easy cases in the morning and the more complex, more severe cases in the afternoon? No, nothing like that. It turns out it's decision fatigue. That when you are confronted with decision after decision, it's a cognitive overload. Think about like a bathtub, and all the decisions are filling up that bathtub, and it really fires your cognition, right? When it starts overflowing, you get completely overloaded. And what will happen is you will have a bias towards the safest possible decision, which in their case was don't grant parole. For most people, the safest possible decision is do nothing for two very good reasons. One is that doing something 70% of the time will be harmful, not helpful. And secondly, we feel that somehow by doing nothing, I can't be blamed. I can only be blamed if I did something, not if I did nothing. But the Bible told us that, errors of omission, walking past the person and not helping is also a sin, right? So that to me is a very interesting. There's been scientific research that's been around for a few decades, but we've never taken this and said, how can I take that research and apply it directly? So one of my PhD students, she's taken this research to cover a very sensitive topic. If you look at most fields in the world, academic, business, you still get by far the majority of men at the top. Why is that? In many areas where discrimination has been practically removed, why do you still find majority men in a ratio of about, out of every 10 most successful CEOs, most successful academics, doctors, you pick any field, about 60 to 80% of them are men, right? Why is that? It turns out that women make many more decisions than men. Just think about what to wear every day, right? I don't know for you, but it's for me like maybe 5 minutes, right? For the typical woman, this is about an hour decision. And she's going through so many scenarios, opens up all the options that you have, many more options than what we have, right? Each of these options have pros and cons. She's trying to weigh out how will this make her feel? How will it make other people think about her? So complex. By the time the woman arrives at work, she's already overwhelmed, decision fatigued. And as a result, they won't make risky decisions. It defaults to the safest possible option, which is don't make a decision or pick the safest possible route. And it turns out, as you know, to be successful in most things requires courage, requires you to be able to differentiate between taking risk versus being reckless, right? These are two fundamentally different things. But if you are overwhelmed, you look at them as the same. You think that taking risks are being reckless. So that's like a practical example of how the scientific research has been there for a long time, but we haven't really taken it back and turned it into a very simple, practical way that can help people get out of these vicious cycles that we get into.
Yeah, it reminds me of the saying, you live or die by the sword. You got to step into the battle to be able to find out. But again, you got want to pick the right battle and have the smarts. Is this what
Yes.
I'm going to take on? But when I do, I'm fully in.
Yeah.
What then is and I know you train so many people, whether it's through your programs, your books, your students, all the different stuff that you do. How do you then begin to help somebody become better at decision making? Because we could hear it, we can try it,
Yes.
we still make the wrong decision, or we make another decision that ends up being wrong. What is some of the tips or tools or suggestions you have if someone's watching this? And I'll give you a scenario that just came to
Yeah.
mind. They're in a relationship, they've been there for 15 years, they're financially reliant on the other person, but they're miserable. And they keep doing the same thing again and again, expecting a different outcome. But they also know that if they don't move, they're going to be in the same place another 10 years and missed out on life.
Yeah.
How do you take it where it's not just a conscious decision, it's now something that becomes part of their life?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is that for most people, the decisions that we make are subconscious, right? We make about 35,000 decisions every day. Most of those decisions are made in the subconscious mind. It's in fully automatic mode. We react, we don't respond. So that's the first part, is to say, the first thing that you need to do is to say, is this an important decision for me? If it is, then don't be tempted to react. Go back into the slow mode of flow and have a technique like the Procon Cloud Drive developed, is one of those techniques where it forces you to slow down your thinking and it forces you to look at it from all possible angles. There's 4 dimensions, right? I have 2 options: leave, which is the solution to the suffering that I may be going through, versus stay, which is the current status quo. Why is it such a difficult decision? Because both sides have pros, both sides have cons. None of them are viable options, right? If I go, I have to give up all the pros. Like people will say, well, at least I have a roof over my head, right? Better the devil I know than the one I don't know. There are lots of pros of the status quo, right? There's also the cons of the solution of leaving. What will happen? So rather than keeping all of this stuff in my mind and making me feel completely overwhelmed, is take a piece of paper, say, here's the problem. There's a gap in my wealth, health, happiness. This gap is important. There's pain because there's a gap. There will be a major gain if I can close the gap. So that's what makes it important. What's my solution? What's the alternative? The status quo. Now let me try to think about what's the pros of both options, what's the cons of both options. And what I'm really looking for is a breakthrough. A breakthrough is something that gives me all the pros, none of the cons. So if I can give you a practical example, right? Let's say that you're overweight, right? And you know you're overweight and it's really impacting your self-confidence, your health, diabetic. It's impacting the people that care for you, your kids, your wife worries about you. So, okay, that's an important enough event, right? To make sure I'm responding to it. Okay, what's the solution? Is to maybe go on a keto diet with, right? Okay, great. What's the alternative? Keep eating what I want. Right. So the first thing is you have to give yourself some credit to say, why do you keep on eating what you want? Because in your subconscious, there's a benefit of that you don't want to lose. And in your subconscious, there's a major risk of following the keto diet that you don't want to gain. So by looking at those two boxes and writing down what they are, so being able to eat what I want helps me to cope with stress, right? And following the keto diet, maybe that's very expensive. It will take me a lot of effort, more effort to figure out what I'm going to eat on the menu. Those are negatives that I don't want. So what's a breakthrough? A breakthrough is what I call change plus plus. Make the change, but add something so you don't give up on the positive of the status quo. So what can I add to still have a way of coping with stress? How do other people cope with stress? Some meditate, some exercise, some have connection with people. Great. That will make it more of a viable option. I've added something rather than having to give up something. I've added something. And then the second plus is what can I add to make it less costly, less risky, less effortful? Well, maybe I can pre-order meals, keto meals. And now I have a breakthrough. So none of the options are viable because both options means I must give up something I want and live with something I don't want. We all have the ability to innovate just by being able to ask the right questions. What can you add?
It really sounds like the first state of change, if that's the right way to say it, has to be self-honesty.
Yes.
Because you can't turn around and address the real core issues until you want to admit what's truly happening.
Yes.
And we hide behind that, both in the conscious and the subconscious.
Yeah.
Looking at the state right now of, I don't think that if the world has ever been in such a flux as it is right now and so divided and country against country and all the economic stuff's going on. What is the state that people are in right now with the decisions they're making that really aren't helping anybody because we're just separating each other further and further apart? How is that, or what would you say would be a system or thought process where people start saying, I'm sick and tired of always being angry, or I'm sick and tired of always being attacked, or I'm tired of attacking? How could we address that for an effect that we start building communities again?
I think the first part is going back to your opening statement. It might feel to us like it's worse than ever, right? But is it really worse than ever? I mean, humanity has gone through some really bad times, If I look at my life today, it's pretty comfortable, right? Yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, but there will always be uncertainty, right? I heard Tony Robbins this morning on one of the seminars that he was doing, and he was asking a person, some breakthrough that you got. And the person said it's a statement that Tony made. He said the biggest problem that most people have is they think that you shouldn't have problems, right? It's like, no, that's life. Life is messy. There's a lot of visible complexity. There's a lot of issues out there. That will never change. The question is, so what? Right? Is what's happening in the world something that I can influence? Right? And is it important to me? If the answer to both those questions is yes, then you say, okay, now what must I do about it? It's like, so what, now what, right? If you get a good answer to so what, life is messy. So what? Trump has made another statement that's crazy. He wants to, get Greenland. Well, that's so horrible. So what? Like, Can you do anything about it? Right. Okay. Now what? What are your options? Right. And each of these options have pros and cons. And you're stuck because none of them has only pros and no cons. So take the time, sit down, look at the options that you have and evaluate them. What are the pros of both? What's the cons of both? And can you come up with an option that has a big upside if it works? It gives me the pros of both just by adding a few things, and a small downside if it doesn't. I can find a way of mitigating all the cons or most of the important cons. And that to me is what I would propose. It's like, first of all, life is complex. There's a lot of visible complexity. There's a lot of problems. There's a lot of expectation gaps. So what? That's what makes life interesting, right? It's not what happens to us. It's the meaning that we give to what happens to us, right?
Mm.
That causes suffering. What happens will happen. Whether we're here or not, it happens. It's the meaning we give to this world that's going on at the moment. Oh my God, it's like AI and robotics. I'm not going to have a job. Or fantastic. Now I can build a business I always wanted without having to deal with people, and it's very low cost, etc. So that to me is the best thing, is just, like you say, be honest about what's happening in the world. Is it something that you can change? No. Is it something that will directly impact you? If it's yes, then what can you do about it? What are your options? And your responsibility is to pick or create the best possible option for you and the people that you care about.
Yeah, again, you make it, going back to your point, so simple with all the complexity behind it. It actually does come down, and I've had that in business decisions where people have said, "How did you make that decision?" I said, "Well, I just simplified it."
Mm-hmm.
There's a story I'd love to share with you about
Yeah.
Mark Burnett, the creator of Survivor, The Apprentice, Celebrity
Yes.
Apprentice, The Voice, Shark Tank, and stuff. And he was in the paratroop regiment, and they were out on a sortie, and they came to a fork in the road. This was before they had satellite and all the GPS and stuff. And there was a fork, not even in the road, it was in the mountain, that wasn't on the map. And the whole platoon sat there for 2 hours trying to figure out with the compass and, okay, where are we going to go? And if we go left or right, and we could end up messing up. And they took 2 hours. After that, they decided to take the left fork. 300 meters down that fork, it came to a dead end. So if they had just made a decision on the knowledge that they had and took action, they would have known within 2 or 3 minutes that they were in the wrong place and gone back the right way, or made a decision, took that path, and they would have ended up at their destination. And so his whole thing is take the knowledge you have, evaluate it, and then make a decision. Don't procrastinate, because you've always got the freedom to pivot. But if you don't take the time to pivot when you know it's wrong, you're going to crash. And if you never take a step forward, you'll never leave where you're at. And
I think it's such beautiful advice in terms of decision making, right? One of the other quotes that I've put on my wall because it's so true. It's like when you hear these quotes and they just resonate with you, you know, like it's fundamental truth. Yogi Berra, right? He said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it, right? And it's most people don't take it because of fear. And that fear is often not because of physical danger anymore, right? The fear is there to protect the identity, the ego, the need to not be blamed or feel shame. So Jeff Bezos has got a great framework for making these type of decisions, right? He says there's one-way and two-way decisions. A two-way decision is you have multiple doors in front of you. You're not sure which one to open. A two-way one is you open the first one, you step inside, you look around, you go, no, that's not what I wanted, right? And you step back out and you try the next one. Says, don't overthink two-way decisions. Do experiments, right? But when it's a one-way decision, where once you're inside, you are stuck there. You have to do the best with what you've got. Those are ones that require deep thinking, deep consideration, right? Really take your time there. I'm fascinated, when I meet very successful people, I would say probably of every 10 people that I've interviewed, between 8 and 9 of them, if I ask them what's the most important decision that you've ever made in your life, you've made so many, we make 35,000 decisions every day, right? What's the most important one, the most consequential? 8, sometimes 9 out of 10 will tell me it's the romantic partner that you select. And secondly, it would be your business partner. If you get that wrong, it's devastating. If you get it right, it's like a catalyst to amplify whatever you could do by yourself. So that to me is, again, it's like the inherent simplicity there is just like, how do I make these really complex decisions? That's why we evolved feelings, but we have to be honest about our feelings and not think about likely outcomes, but think best case, worst case. And, listen to feedback, right? Normally you find somebody falls in love, your hormones is going crazy. You're in that honeymoon. All that you want to do is your mind is trying to get you to procreate, right? But you often get red flags coming along that you ignore, right? Is to reflect on those two things. One of the things that one of my mentors said is, the way people do one thing is the way they do everything. Pay attention to that. If you find them being disrespectful to some people, if you find them being hateful to some people, if you find them to be judgmental, if you find them that want them to take revenge, these are all big red flags, especially when it happens when they're trying to put their best foot forward, right? But that's a two-way decision, right? It's like experiment, be with them, maybe move in together if you have to, try it out, but pay attention to those red flags while you can get out. Once you get married, it's hard to get out. It's very costly, emotionally, financially, all the things. So those decisions really, think about one way, two way. That to me is very useful in terms of how much effort I should spend in there. Sometimes it's just, let's design a quick experiment, get the feedback. No, it didn't work. Let me try something different. Or no, this requires me to really put my mind to it.
Do you have a specific decision that you made that you look back and go, that was my biggest life lesson?
I mean, there's a couple, right? I'm very reflective, so I'm constantly looking at that. I remember I was being interviewed back in 2009, and the podcaster said to me, Dr. Barnard, are there any things that you regret? And I gave him my standard answer, which is really how I feel, is I think that regret is not helpful.
Mm.
It's mostly harmful. So I don't think in terms of regrets. But she was persistent. She said, come on, there must be something, that you regret. And I said, yeah, there's two things, I think. One is that, I traveled a lot when I was younger. And I realized that not spending enough time with my 2 boys at the time to explain to them why I was traveling so much. And that if they really wanted me to be at a specific event, I will do whatever it takes to be there. But unless they tell me it's really important, I'm not going to be there because I'm traveling. I'm doing the things that I'm passionate about. And one day they will become a dad and they will be in the same position, right? But I don't think I spent enough time. So there comes points in time where they say, but Dad, you weren't there. And it really hurt my feelings. And my response was, but did you ask me to be there? No. Why not? Well, you're always busy. Right? So that was something I really regret, that I didn't make enough effort to say, it's your right, but also your responsibility to tell me what you need from me. Right? And then if I don't deliver, then blame me. But don't blame me if you don't tell me. So that was one. And the other thing that I regret was I had a tough upbringing. I went through a lot of stuff when I was a kid, but then somehow figured it out. I became head boy at my school, became junior mayor of our town. was the top of the class, Um, so by 2009, my life was really good. So I said to her, the other thing I regret is not failing enough, because that's when we really learn, right? And I think what the universe did was to say, okay, I can help with that. And up to 2009, financially very successful, great marriage, great relationship with the kids, great health. Literally within a year, all of that was gone, right? Everything collapsed around me. And I realized that I had optimized my life around stability, things going well. And I didn't have any of the buffers that you need: financial buffers, psychological buffers, relationship capital buffers that you really, really need when you go through crisis. And it's actually one of the books that I've written about that is telling that story. It's called From Fragile to Robust to Anti-Fragile. Is most of us and most of our businesses are much more fragile than we think. We are hurt much more by negative events than what we benefit from positives, right? So even if we get randomly those events, E plus R equal O, even if we randomly get equal positives and negatives, if you hurt more by negative than what you benefit from a positive, the net impact will compound and you'll go collapse. So how do you get to robust? Is you need a mechanism to avoid the really big negative impacts. How do you become anti-fragile? Is you need a mechanism to really capitalize on the positive side. So that's kind of in a nutshell, two things that I regret that I've now learned a lot from and are practicing what I preach now.
I really appreciate you sharing that, because I'm also a big believer that we shouldn't have regret. There's no point, it doesn't bring any value. But when I said earlier, in the conversation that I had the one regret, it's because of sadness. I wish I had been smarter at the time to not have reacted the way I did, because I wasn't looking at what do I actually want. I was looking at how do I feel.
Yeah.
And Mr. Wonderful, from Shark Tank, Kevin Leary, he turned around and said he won't invest in any business person unless they failed at least 3 times. And when you look at that and say, what's the value? Because wouldn't you want to be with someone that's always successful? Well, I was in the same position as yourself as well, where everything was flying. And then suddenly the universe equalized everything out and said, if you want it, you're going to have to learn these lessons.
Yeah.
And I love that, because I have a saying, everything's a gift that happens to us if we wrap it correctly. We have to learn the lesson from it, and we can have more, stronger, greater, and as you say, the anti-fragile impact, because we're still safe within ourselves.
Yeah, I think that, it's a great kind of message, I think, to end off with, right? Is, as I mentioned, it's when we study people that are suffering, it's not what happened to them in life. It's the meaning they give to what happens to them in life. Our bodies can recover from the physical harm and the injury much, much faster than what we recover from emotionally. And that intrigued me. Why is that? Surely it should be the opposite, right? But it's the meaning that we give to things. What I want to leave the viewers and listeners with is one thing is we have to give ourselves and other people some credit in 2 ways. It's a very complex world that we live in. It's very easy to make bad decisions. It's very hard to learn from them when we do, because of those lags in time and space, right? So give yourself and other people some credit. We're all trying our best, right? We're always doing our best. I know it's hard to intellectualize, but that to me was a profound insight. We're always doing our best, considering. Considering what? Considering the information I had, which includes my beliefs and assumptions, etc. So if I want to do better, I have to figure out what conditions will I change, right? Physical conditions. Can I put myself in a different environment? Or mental conditions. Can I have a different belief, a different assumption, a different meaning? Because those are the only cases when I will get a different outcome. It's like if event, then outcome, right? If I want a different outcome, I must change either the events, the conditions, or I must change the response. And the response comes directly from what we believe.
Fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, because I think what you've done is planted seeds that's going to make people sit there and really reevaluate what they're doing, how they do it, what their emotional reaction is, what the upside, what the downside is, and really start looking. And it is, I fully support your message that we have to make the change for ourselves with the decisions that we make, because our life can be everything we dream it to be.
Absolutely. And feelings are important. That's the thing that have differentiated us, at least for now, from AI, right? Is that we have feelings. Feelings have a downside. They can cause us to overreact and underreact, but they can also allow us to make massively complex decisions very quickly and often with great outcomes, regardless of how little information we had or how little we could predict what will happen. So it's like treasure your feelings, but I think the ability to control feelings and emotions are really fundamental to success. That's the one lesson I took away, is that the most successful people, do they get sad? Absolutely. Did I get massively happy? Absolutely. But it doesn't go very deep and it doesn't last very long. It's when it goes too deep and it lasts too long that those same emotions can become very harmful rather than helpful. So, yes, experience the emotion, but not too deep, not too long, and get on with life.
Beautiful. What's the one book out of the ones that you've written that if anybody said, I want to learn more and I want to be able to take that in, what's the one book that you would recommend?
I have the one from fragile to robust to anti-fragile, I think is a very broad, applicable one. It's basically, how do I transform my life, my relationship, or my business from fragile to robust to anti-fragile. So that's probably the one I would recommend.
Love it. Dr. Allen, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your experiments, and your time with us. And again, invaluable information. I'm so proud to have had you on Born Superhuman, and I look forward to seeing you again at the next event.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Dan. It's been a real honor.
Thank you.